Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Brian Radley from the Department of English and Related Literature. I just want to introduce tonight's introduction. Tonight's Festival of Ideas event comes out of the Creative Dissonance Research Strand, which is sponsored by the Centre for Modern Studies. And it's co-organised by Dr. Alexandra Kingston-Reese and myself. It takes inspiration from the formal and effective dissonance that's so prominent in contemporary writing and has two aims, which are to explore the way that dissonance drives contemporary literary criticism and experimentation. And there's an increasing defiance, we think, in literary criticism today. So no longer satisfied with the structures of critique, we're being encouraged to adopt deep reading, distant reading, and surface reading. To forego reading suspiciously in favour of reading generously. A part of what distinguishes this project is its twin focus on literary and critical practice. In other words, we want to bring together writers and critics. So hopefully that's what tonight's event is all about. And just to introduce Alexandra, she's my colleague in the Department of English and Related Literature. She's a lecturer in modern and contemporary literature with specific interests in visual culture and the writing of the last decade. She's at work on a first monograph called Writing Against the Image, and this looks at the 21st century novel's negative aesthetic experiments and experiences and what the form looks like as it embraces visual culture and intermediality. Spinning out of the monograph are two new book projects, so very productive person. So global literature and visual culture, and there's also a collected edition of contemporary novelists on art, which is a great title called The Curated Eye. And of course, Alexandra is also the co-organizer of Creative Dissonance, this CMOD's research strand. So I'll now hand over to her to introduce this evening's reading and interview. Thank you.
Sort of domino. Okay, so thanks, Brian, for that very generous introduction. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Eleanor Catton tonight, although I'll do so very briefly. Born in Canada, Eleanor grew up in New Zealand, which is also where I'm from. So it's going to be a real sort of New Zealand feast tonight. So her debut novel, The Rehearsal, was published 10 years ago. It's boldly experimental, and it's brilliantly written, and I'm sure some of you might have already read this. And it's set against the backdrop of a scandalous relationship between a high school student and her music teacher. It won a number of major prizes, including the Adam Award, the Best First Book Award at the 2009 Montana Book Awards, and the 2009 Betty Trask Award. It was the same innovation and penetrating insight that led to Eleanor's second novel, The Luminaries, and after publication, on to win the 2013 Man Booker Prize. A novel that at first glance appears as vast as the constellations it draws on for inspiration, The Luminaries nonetheless share The Rehearsal's intimacy and stylistic flair. And once an intricate astrological murder mystery and a compelling love story, the novel also won the Governor-General's Award in Canada and was shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize. And I just wanted to draw a line from one of my favourite reviews of the novel, which remarks that reading the novel is fundamentally fun, like doing a Charlotte Bronte-themed crossword puzzle while playing chess and Dance Dance Revolution on a bongo board. And I just love that, on a bongo board. I don't know what that is, but it sounds so evocative. So one of the pleasures of being able to chat to a writer like Eleanor is that we get to get inside the head of the books we love and of the writers we love. We get to see how an obsession develops and how it ends up in its final form on the page. This helps us as readers to get closer to the creative process and to see how books come to be. And in this way, literature becomes a living, breathing thing, which I think is something as readers and writers we all appreciate. So on that note of creativity, Brian has mentioned Creative Dissonance. I also wanted to thank our partners, Writers at York, my colleague J.D. Welsh, and the Festival of Ideas, both of which have made this event possible in a variety of ways. So enough from me. we're going to have the absolute pleasure of having Eleanor read from the Luminaries, and then we'll have a chat afterwards, and then there'll be a chance for some audience questions at the end. Okay.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to be here. York was actually my first ever international trip as a baby. I had an aunt who used to live here, so I don't really remember it, but I was 3 years old. Apparently I rode a bus. I'm going to read from the Luminaries, as Alexandra mentioned. I'll just give you a little bit of background before I start to read. The novel is set in 1865-66 on the west coast, mostly on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island, which is a place, if you've ever been there, is an incredibly remote, very, very dramatically beautiful part of the country. So a lot like the west coast of Ireland, really. When gold was discovered there in 1864, that part of the country was entirely uninhabited, even by Māori, who had no interest in gold, really, but travelled there in order to source greenstone, which was their kind of prized mineral. And so the discovery of gold meant that there was this sudden kind of explosion of civilization with people coming from all over the world. And it was such a dangerous landing on the beach. The mountains really just go very suddenly right down into the ocean, that there were just hundreds and hundreds of shipwrecks. Drowning became known as the West Coast disease, which I just love that phrase. And it's very treacherous to get there, and a kind of interesting theatre, I thought, to play out a kind of a murder mystery. Something that really interested in me when I started researching the area, the area and the period, was how many of the crimes that took place were what we would call white-collar crimes rather than what we would call any other kind of crime. So rather than there being a kind of a lawless Wild West kind of aesthetic, there were many, many instances of fraud, which I love as a writer. So this book is a lot about fraud. So that's to set up the book in one way, but then to set it up in quite another way. The book has a cast of 20 main characters. 7 of these are, all of these are modelled on the figures of the classical heavens, the kind of classical astrology, the figures that you can see with the naked eye. The 12 signs of the zodiac are all typified in the novel as people. The 7 planets are all also people. And then the point of the goldfields itself, which is a crucial component in astrology, the fixed point on Earth from which the picture of the sky is kind of generated, or from which it's seen, is also a character. So all that's to say, I'm about to read you a scene with 3 characters in it, a man and 2 women. And it takes place on the 18th of February, 1866, in Hokitika, at this town on the west coast of the South Island. And if you had been on the beach in Hokitika in 1866, on the 18th of February, and you had looked up into the sky, you would have seen that Mercury and Venus were both in the constellation of Capricorn. So the scene I'm going to read you is a scene between Mercury, Venus, and Capricorn. Though that is not at all necessary to your enjoyment of the scene, I hope. I should maybe set up the story a little bit, sorry. Just before the book begins, a very wealthy and very lucky man in this town, a young prospector, disappears. And much of the book is taken up with speculation as to why he's disappeared and what has happened to him. And so in the scene I'm about to read, a seance has been organised to try and make contact with him, though it's not yet been established whether or not he's dead or just missing. Mr. Walter Moody, Mrs. Lydia Wells, said Gascoigne. Mr. Moody has come from Hokitika from Scotland, Mrs. Wells, to make his fortune in the gorge. Mrs. Wells, as you will know, Mr. Moody, is the mistress of this establishment and a great enthusiast of realms. Lydia made a very pretty curtsy and Moody a short but respectful bow. Moody then paid the necessary compliments to his hostess, thanking her very nicely for the evening's entertainment and praising her renovations of the old hotel. Despite his best efforts, the compliments came out very flat. When he looked at her, he thought only of Lauderback and Crosby Wells. When he had finished speaking, she said, "Do you have an interest in the occult, Mr. Moody?" A question which Moody could not answer honestly without risking offence. He paused only a moment, however, before replying, "There are many things that are yet arcane to me, Mrs. Wells, and I hope that I am a curious man. If I am interested in those truths that are yet unknown, it is only so that they might in time be made known, or to put it more plainly, so that in time I might come to know them." "You are wonderfully free with one verb, I notice," the widow returned. "What does it mean for you, Mr. Moody, to know something? I fancy you put rather a lot of stock in knowing, judging from the way you speak." Moody smiled. "Why," he said, "I suppose that to know a thing is to see it from all sides." "To see it from all sides," the widow repeated. "But I confess you catch me off guard. I have not spent any time working on the definition and should not like to hear it quoted back to me, at least not until I have spent some time thinking about how I might defend it." "No," the widow agreed. "Your definition leaves much to be desired. There are so many exceptions to the rule. How could one possibly see a spirit from all sides, for example? The notion is incredible." Moody gave another short bow. "You are quite right to name that as an exception, Mrs. Wells, but I am afraid I do not believe a spirit can be known at all by anyone, and I certainly do not believe a spirit can be seen. I do not mean to impugn your talents in the slightest, but there it is. I do not believe in spirits categorically." "And yet you applied for a ticket to the séance this evening," the widow pointed out. My curiosity was piqued. "By the particular spirit in question, perhaps?" "Mr. Staines," Moody shrugged. "I've never met the man. I arrived in Hokitika some fortnight after he disappeared, but since then I have heard his name many times, of course." "Mr. Gascoigne says that you have come to Hokitika to make your fortune." "Yes, so I hope." "And how will you make it?" "By dint of hard work and good planning, I expect." "Well, of course, there are many rich men who work little and plan nothing at all." "Those men are lucky," Moody said. "Do you not wish to be lucky also?" "I wish to be able to call myself deserving of my lot," Moody said carefully. "Luck is by nature undeserved." "What an honourable answer," said Lydia Wells. "And a truthful one, I hope," said Moody. "Aha," said the widow, "we are back to truth again." Gascoigne had been watching Lydia Wells. You see how her mind is working," he said to Moody. "She will swoop down in a moment and savage your argument. Prepare yourself." "I hardly know how to prepare to be savaged," Moody said. Gascoigne was right. The widow lifted her chin and said, "Are you a man of religion, Mr. Moody?" "I am a man of philosophy," he rejoined. "Those aspects of religion that can be called philosophy interest me extremely. Those that cannot, do not." "Oh, I see," said Lydia Wells. "I am afraid that in my case it is quite the reverse. It is only those philosophies that can be called religions that hold any interest for me." Gascoigne laughed outright at this. "Very good," he said, wagging his finger. "That's very good." Moody was amused despite himself by the widow's acuity, but he was determined not to let her take the upper hand. "It seems that we have little in common, Mrs. Wells," he said. "I hope that this lack of common ground will not be an impediment to friendship." "We disagree upon the validity of spirits. We have established that much," said Lydia Wells. "But let me put the contrary question to you. What about a soul, a living soul? Do you believe that you can know a person who is living if you cannot know a person who is dead?" Moody considered this, smiling. After a moment, the widow went on. "Do you feel that you could ever truly know your friend Mr. Gascoigne, for example? Can you see him from all sides?" Gascoigne looked very peeved for having been used as a rhetorical example and said so aloud. The widow shushed him and put the question to Moody a second time. Moody looked at Gascoigne. In fact, he had anatomized Gascoigne's character to a very fine degree of detail over the 3 weeks of their acquaintance. He felt that he understood the scope and limits of the man's intelligence, the quality of his sentiment, and the tenor of his many expressions and habits. He felt as a whole that he could summarize the man's character very accurately. But he knew that Lydia Wells was intending to trap him, and in the end he chose to reply very blandly indeed, repeating that he had only arrived in Hokitika but 3 weeks ago, and could not hope to form an accurate assessment of Gascoigne's soul in such a time. That project, he added, would require more than 3 weeks of observation. Mr. Moody was Mr. Carver's passenger, Gascoigne put in. He arrived on the Godspeed the very night she came to ground. Moody felt a stirring of unease at this disclosure. He had used a false name while booking his passage upon Godspeed, and he did not like to advertise the fact that he had arrived in Hokitika upon that craft, given the nature of what he had witnessed, or imagined that he had witnessed, in the hours before the ship had foundered. He looked at the widow, seeking in her face some flicker of doubt or recognition that might show that she had known about the bloody phantom in Godspeed's hold. But Lydia Wells was smiling. "Did he?" she said, looking Moody up and down. "Then I'm afraid Mr. Moody is a very common specimen of a man indeed." "How so?" Moody said stiffly. The widow laughed. "You are a lucky man who is scornful of the notion of luck," she said. "I am afraid, Mr. Moody, that I've met a great many men like you." Before Moody could think of a reply to this, she picked up a small silver bell, rang it sharply, and announced in a voice that was no less penetrating for its husky half-whisper that all those without tickets were to make their departures at once, for the séance was about to begin. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that.
Yeah, cheers.
And so tantalising too. I want to know what happens in okay, so I mean, maybe we start with that passage that you just read. I mean, when did that kind of idea of holding a séance in this novel, like, how did that come to you, that you knew that you wanted that kind of interaction between characters?
That's an interesting question. I find any question about origins really difficult to answer, actually, and I find that I always give a different answer every time I ask. Yeah. I think that one of the funny things about creating a novel of any kind is that the order of origins is not necessarily. It's not like a human being kind of begins at the moment of conception. It's like you begin with the meeting of the great-great-great-grandparents that all they have to kind of have all of this kind of very tangled family tree, and then finally you get to kind of the moment of conception almost at the very end of the process. It's this kind of coming to a point. And so really, I mean, the Luminaries had a very strange journey to the page. The west coast of the South Island has always been quite an important part of the country for me. My parents are kind of hippie types, and there was this kind of very important rite of passage in my family where I'm the youngest of three, and my father would take on the back of a tandem bicycle each one of us over the one mountain range in New Zealand and then come back over the other. So we'd kind of go from one ocean to the other, I guess. This trip takes about kind of 4 days. And it was this big trip that we had to make. And I was very rude about it at the time and thought it was just the least cool thing, that, which it really was, that a kind of a 12-year-old girl can think of doing with her father. But I think that there's something about putting in that kind of effort and crossing a body of land and on your own steam that kind of gives you a different relationship to the land itself. I don't feel like I could have written about that part of the country if I hadn't made that journey in a funny kind of way. I also have a connection to the West Coast through my mum, who was, when I was growing up, she was a brilliant career for a novelist to be the daughter of. She was a school librarian. She designed library collections in schools, and her jurisdiction kind of was the West Coast of the South Island. So I quite often travelled there with her to visit these libraries. So there was this connection there, but the kind of the formal apparatus of the book was almost kind of born. I mean, it was kind of all or nothing, you know, because it's such a highly formally determined book. Back in, sorry, there's a very long-winded answer to your question. I'm a very long-winded person, as you can see. You may only have to ask one question tonight.
That probably suits me just fine.
Back in about, I guess, 2008, my dad had sent me this computer-generated kind of program where you could put in, type in the date and time and place of anywhere on Earth, anytime, and you could just see what was happening in the skies at that time. So it's quite interesting. I mean, you can put in the birthdays of your favourite novelists, so you can see what was happening when Hamlet was performed on stage for the first time, or whatever. And I was really fascinated by this, and I was starting to think about the connection between the word. Obviously, the word fortune means both your fate, the thing that is handed to you and that you in no way create, but also the thing that we all believe, we all kind of speak about as though it can be ultimately the thing that you can make. You can make your fortune. You can become a self-made man. You know, this term that was gaining currency around about the time the book was set. So I plugged in the date that gold was first discovered on the West Coast, and plugged in the coordinates for Hokitika, and just started to watch the sky go round, really. And I didn't really know what I was looking for, but I knew that I kind of had this idea that I could write. There was a novel in there somewhere, so I started to take notes and to figure out how the planets moved. I mean, Jupiter and Saturn, because they're very large, they don't move that much, but obviously the sun moves in a very predictable way, and so does the moon, and the smaller planets kind of jump around quite a bit. And once I'd watched the sky for the duration of the whole of the gold rush, and kind of looked at where the planets moved, I kind of thought, okay, if I was to design a novel out of this in a way that would be historically accurate to the movements of the stars, where would I begin? And I had discovered, I'd been reading a lot of Carl Jung. I was just in love with him at that point. He was kind of got me into astrology in many ways. And I had discovered that the very center of our galaxy, because our galaxy is it's kind of this kind of shape, and our solar system is on one of the outer arms. So the reason why we see the Milky Way as a stripe across the sky is because we're looking sideways into the kind of the heart of the galaxy. And I discovered that the very center of our galaxy lies between the constellations of Scorpio and Sagittarius, which for an astrologer this is very exciting because Scorpio is the kind of associated with dreams and death and kind of a descent into the darkness. And Sagittarius is associated with journeys and kind of flights of fancy and the imagination and kind of moving out of that dark place. And so the idea that the center of our galaxy, which, I mean, people whether the zodiac was invented or whether it invented us, who's to say? But back when the zodiac was kind of presumably a kind of relatively new invention, they could not have possibly known that the center of the galaxy was in this place. So anyway, it's very, very exciting. So I thought I really want to begin with the sun in Sagittarius. So this is where the book begins, and kind of tracks kind of a calendar year, really. It jumps back to the year before at a certain point, but it kind of tracks a journey of the sun around the Earth. Anyway, so this is, I completely do not recommend this as a way of writing a novel. It was a big headache, and it was pretty interesting. I mean, I think that formally determined projects, they always have to kind of prove their worth, really. They have to prove their usefulness, or they have to prove their reason for being in a way that that maybe more conventional novels don't necessarily have to do that. But it was an interesting experiment for me to think about this question of, are we determined by what happens to us, or did we in some way create the narrative of what happens to us? Like, what is that kind of push and pull? The idea that will and fate are very closely intertwined with one another. When we think about kind of classical heroes, they're always very willful people. The people that we understand to have destinies are never people who sit around and watch television all day. You never think, oh, that was his destiny to be a couch potato. Somebody with destiny is somebody who acts, and that's really interesting actually, because it's in some way there's a kind of a push and pull that happens between will and the will and fate. Anyway, I still haven't answered your question. The seance. I mean, the really pedestrian answer is that the seance kind of happened because I had to get Venus into the constellation, who's Lydia Wells, is typifying desire and kind of, in a way, she's the kind of the great charlatan of the book, the only astrologer in the book, really. I had to kind of get her into an astrological place that would make sense of what was really happening in the skies at that time. But the less pedestrian version of the answer is that I think that any mystery is made so much fun when you have people falling into trances, becoming addicted to substances, kind of getting knocked in, being unconscious. You need places where people are not themselves in order to make the mystery really exciting. So I kind of knew from the beginning that I wanted this set piece of the seance to I don't know, as a kind of a set piece, I suppose. Yeah. My husband is a poet, and he says that every poet has a poem about John Coltrane. And I kind of feel like every novelist is allowed one seance as well. I feel like it's a similar thing.
I wish there were more seances in contemporary fiction in particular. I think we'll make it more interesting. I suppose, I'm really interested in this idea of the unconscious and how, I suppose putting people in or characters into situations where they aren't themselves and they're forced to perform, different kinds of roles. And also this idea of predetermination as well. I mean, I noticed, formally speaking, at the beginning of your chapters, you've got these little sort of explanations as to what's to come. There's a sense of, the form is kind of, sort of charting what is about to happen. I think it's really interesting that I suppose the kind of astrological structure and the formal structure kind of map onto one another in really interesting ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is actually a very robust and very deeply psychological architecture. The idea of the kind of the classical heavens. People kind of tend to shrink away from it because I think it hasn't got a very a good reputation, really. I mean, people who, as soon as somebody asks you what your sign is, you kind of start running a mile. And it can be, I mean, it has been trivialized extremely in kind of contemporary culture for sure. But one thing that I discovered that I was really fascinated by is that classical astrology has a lot in common with Western music. So in music, you of course have in a scale, you have 12 semitones. So if you go from a C to a C above, you can make 12 jumps to get there, and using all the black notes on the piano. But you can also get there in 7 jumps if you're just doing the scale. So you're just doing the key signature and none of the chromatic stuff. You can get there in 7. So there's this patterning of a 12 against a 7. And they're actually quite weird numbers to be paired against one another, because 7 is a little bit more than half. They don't divide into one another at all neatly. 12 is a perfectly circular number. Of course, you have the numbers around the face of a clock. And it divides both into 3 and into 4 in this very beautiful way. You get a peace sign or a quartered circle. But 7 is prime, and it doesn't divide into anything, or nothing divides into it. And so there's this kind of interesting relationship that they have between one another. that is also a kind of a geometric relationship. In music, if you have a string and you pluck it, you'll get a certain sound will come. And if you halve the length of that string and pluck it again, the interval that you produce will be a major interval, a dominant interval. And so there's all these ways that music is kind of, and geometry are interacting in this way, that actually astrology speaks to on an emotional level. Musicologists still in kind of 2018 cannot tell you definitively why it is that a major chord sounds triumphant and why an amen sounds a little bit sad but also resolved, and why certain things sound unresolved and why certain things make you a little bit angry or on edge. So there's an emotional component to it, there's a psychological component to music that I think astrology actually speaks to in this really interesting way. And in a way we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater by thinking that we've arrived at this, I don't know what we've arrived at, this kind of, astrology has been replaced by astronomy, this kind of, I just think that's it's bad history of art, it's bad history of the mind, really. Jung called astrology a primitive psychology, and his idea was that over millennia we have projected up into the sky things that are true about our inner lives that we can't see and we will never be able to see, but we've seen them in the stars and we've collectively seen them. And so in a way the stars are this kind of repository of all of the things that people have ever felt and kind of known to be true about human nature. And I love that idea. I mean, it's completely indefensible, but I love its indefensibility.
Well, I love it too. And 7 and 12 have this other really interesting relationship in your writing. In the rehearsal, you have the 7 days of the week, and you have these sections that are written
I've never thought of that.
on these individual, and then the 12 months of the year as well. And I noticed, also in the Luminaries, everything happens on a certain kind of day, and I guess with the astrological kind of framework, that's really significant. But there's this sense of dailiness, or the everyday, the quotidian, things happening in real time and in a kind of real sort of experiential sort of way. I suppose that taps into the kind of psychology that you're sort of talking about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd never made that connection before. It's so interesting. I mean, as you would have heard from the reading, in many ways the Luminaries is a kind of a pastiche of a Victorian novel. I read a lot of Victorian novels while I was writing it, and even just 19th century novels, not necessarily written in English, and to try and imitate their style as much as possible. And one thing that was really fascinating and so much fun about it was realizing how elastic, and especially in the 19th century, I think, which for me was the complete apex of the novel as a form, how elastic time can be. Very often, I mean, I try and imitate a little bit, but very often whole parts of a conversation will be kind of concertinaed out and just rendered indirectly. And then you'll kind of zero in for a while and kind of follow the conversation moment by moment. And there's this incredible sense of control that you get, I think particularly in the 19th century novel, that is very hard to do when you're writing in the present tense. It's only really possible when you're writing in the past tense, I think. To the kind of full extent of that. I think that's really interesting. It's definitely something that I thought a lot about when I was writing. I think that writers tend to have a kind of a natural speed. It's like a resting heartbeat, where you kind of realize that things are kind of happening for your characters, and you kind of need to be able to speed up and slow down, depending on what's interesting or not. So kind of learning how to do that in the context of the 19th century novel form was great fun. Yeah.
I mean, that's fascinating. So, in terms of, it is really interesting that you think the 19th century novel was kind of like the apex of the form. So has it all been downhill since then? Well,
I mean, maybe it's just the period I know the most about because I studied it. so intensely with the Luminaries. I had in my mind that I wanted to write a perfect hybrid of. This is very silly, but the Luminaries was half of Murder on the Orient Express, which is a book I love, also containing a cast of 12, and half The Brothers Karamazov, which is also kind of a highly kind of patterned, kind of constellated novel. The book would be a kind of a fusion of those two. I do think that we might disagree on this, but I do think that relativism has really hurt the novel. That I think that there's something about a kind of a moral framework, a kind of an admission that the novel is a moral project. It always has been. It's the form that takes us closer than any other form to the experience of being someone else, and it's a form that allows you to be with somebody as they learn things. So you can be inside somebody else as they are being educated about themselves or about the world, and no other art form can really do that in the same way. So I feel quite impatient with a lot of contemporary literature when it kind of turns its back on that responsibility. But maybe that's too controversial. I'm not sure.
No, I don't know. Yeah. So, and I'm also wondering about the kind of the future of the novel as well.
I think it's got a very bright future. I think
making a comeback.
Yeah, I think that the novel is unkillable. I think it's a virus that will just mutate until. I think the novel will outlast human beings.
Yeah,
for as long as there are humans, there's always going to be more novels. And the idea that print is dying that's just ridiculous. I think I feel like it's a very important form, actually. I feel really passionately about the novel in particular. I think that it's a way of it gives you access to being other people. I just think that that's such an amazing it's such an amazing thing that even with the kind of the best friends that you can imagine and the kind of the best relationships that you can be in, you're always yourself in those relationships. And there's something about the novel that upends all of that. I mean, you can go anywhere in the world, you can be anybody. I think that it's such a powerful form in that way. That is what I think.
Yeah.
I think that's what I think. I was saying to Alexandra before that I always get in trouble in these things because I change my mind so often that when I learned this was going to be recorded, I was like, oh no, because if this is shown online about 6 months from now, I'll have changed my mind about everything. So, but I don't think I'll be proselytizing the death of the novel, prophesying the death of the novel anytime soon. I think I can stand by that one. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this might be something that you've changed your mind on. I'm just reminded of something you said once about books being like cathedrals, and I mean, do you still believe that, or, or I mean, I suppose I wonder in what kind of sense do you mean like a cathedral? I mean, I can certainly see how the Luminaries is a cathedral is cathedral-like.
Oh yeah, I think maybe. I don't know what I meant by that.
Maybe it was very beautiful. It was a very beautiful image.
I think that the worship has a great deal to do with it. I discovered once, I have no idea whether this is true, but there's an old Oxford, I have no idea how many times this was used, but there's an Oxford English Dictionary entry from about maybe 200 or 300 years ago that has the collective noun for writers as a worship. And I just love that so much. I think it's so brilliant. But I think that there's a kind of a humility that you bring to the reading of a novel, a kind of an openness, an open-heartedness. You're agreeing to lose yourself in a way. You're agreeing to put yourself behind, which is something that very few of us manage at any time ever in our real lives, and yet it's a requirement of reading fiction. And so I think that there is a kind of a sacred element. I feel quite mystical about it, actually. There's a kind of a sacred element to a novelistic experience, but it's also, I mean, it's great. It's fun, It's fun. Mm-hmm. It's fun to leave yourself behind. Mm-hmm. I think that was what I meant by that.
Yeah. So at the moment, you are working on the script for the Luminaries, the BBC television adaptation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I was wondering, I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the kind of process that you've had to undergo to transform, this cathedral-like text into these sort of bite-sized chunks of time.
Oh well, it's been a fascinating process. It's been optioned by BBC Two. It'll be out kind of at about a little over a year from now. We're just about to go into production. And I've now been working on the screenplays for officially longer than it took me to write the book. It's just been an unbelievably, I mean, it's been exhilarating and hellish as the kind of experience. But I think particularly because of this book, because the plot of the book was so formally dictated, it was literally kind of given to me by the stars, and I kind of made I kind of made a plot out of what I found. These kind of points of light, none of that will work on screen at all. I mean, you just have to throw that out before you even begin. And what's very interesting about television, in contrast to the novel, is that there really are kind of natural laws of television. There are no natural laws in the novel, I don't think. I think you can almost do whatever you want. You can play with time. You can play with space. You can have as few or as many characters as you want. You have no budget. Your sentences can be long or short. It doesn't matter. But television, I think, and film in general, is so much about desire. It's so much about wanting. In a good show, you will know what the character wants, and you'll want it too. That's the golden rule of television. If you don't know what they want, you hate the show, and if you don't want it to, then you hate the character. But that's kind of a law that you have to follow. And so what that required in the Luminaries was actually, well, the way that we've approached it is actually turning the novel completely inside out. So it was always one of my ambitions with the book to have a kind of, in a way, a kind of an absent center. That the book kind of has this kind of circular form that revolves around this absent center. The Luminaries, as a word, refers to the sun and the moon, who together in astrology have this kind of partnership, which in a Jungian understanding is kind of the animus and the anima, the masculine and feminine aspects of the self that we present to the world, the extroverted self and the introverted self that we hide from the world, and that they kind of need each other. There's a kind of complementarity. And in the Luminaries, the novel, these two characters are a young boy, the young boy who goes missing, and this young woman, a prostitute, erstwhile prostitute in the town. And in a way, the events of the novel kind of revolve around them. And I was really interested in kind of keeping them almost cipher-like in the novel. They don't appear for a really long time. They have a kind of a almost tangential, well, not tangential because they're in the center of this kind of very peripheral plot, but they have almost an incidental role. And I wanted this because I had this idea that the novel ideally would behave as this kind of would be this kind of revelatory experience for the reader, where you could project onto these figures an aspect of yourself, and that you would read the novel in a different way depending on what kind of book you wanted to read. So in a way you can read it as there's a blackmail story, a kind of a failed blackmail / identity theft that kind of goes horribly wrong. There's another way you can read it as a revenge story if you follow a different character as a main character. There's a detective story if you choose to follow the person who you meet first. But there's another way of reading it as a love story, which is kind of, it's almost the most kind of hidden aspect of the story. So what we've done in the TV show is we've taken that love story and we've made these two characters the main characters of the show, and kind of literally kind of turned everything inside out. So it's been great fun, but it's been a lot of work. Yeah, good work, fun work.
I was wondering, just thinking about, I suppose the similarities between the rehearsal and the Luminaries. We had that time element, that kind of structural time earlier. But the other thing that I was thinking about, as I was rereading both of these novels recently, is the way in which the characters kind of relate to one another. That there's a kind of form in the way that they, I suppose, a form in the kind of relationships that they have with one another. And in the Luminaries, we have that kind of astrological structure that kind of governs their interactions. But we do have that again in the rehearsal, that sense that, in a way, that whether there is a way in which people ought to relate to one another in certain circumstances, and then, ways in which they completely derail that. But again, it's a sort of a form of relation between those characters. And I was wondering...
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, because they're such... On the surface, they're such different books. But I think that there are some commonalities between them. The scheme of the rehearsal, the kind of the governing idea of it really is that there are both actors and characters in the novel, and there are actors playing the characters, and some actors play more than one character, and some actors wish that they'd been given a different character, and so there's these kind of degrees of reality that you're never quite sure where the buck stops, really, like whether you're watching something real or a performance of something real, and if you're watching a performance of something real, then how real is that performance, and so on. I suppose kind of building on ideas of gender theory and feminist, particularly lesbian feminist theory, which I was really interested in at the time, and well, still am, but at the time of writing. But I think what the two books share is this real interest that I have in the idea of a role and a performer in that role. There's this kind of doubleness, this double vision that we get. When we watch a wonderful performer on stage, we go and see Benedict Cumberbatch being Sherlock Holmes or whatever, and we can see both Sherlock Holmes and we can see Benedict Cumberbatch. We can see both things. And we're quite used to doing that. We're used to saying, isn't Benedict Cumberbatch amazing, and isn't Sherlock Holmes so interesting? We can kind of see them both in the same shot, I guess. And this poses really interesting questions for gender theory. This idea that we are performing our gender. What happens, if the actor changes? What happens if as we are, our body language, our clothing, our mannerisms, our way of speaking, what happens if this is exactly mimicked by somebody who doesn't share our sex? What happens then? And then B, what happens if we decide to stop performing in this way? Where does the buck stop then? What can we say is the reality? I find these, I don't really have an answer to the question. I just find them really interesting questions to think about, this doubleness. In the Luminaries, there's a kind of a similar kind of doubleness that happens in terms of the archetype and the character that's filling that archetype. I think it's really important when dealing with these questions to remember that an archetype and a stereotype are almost complete opposites of one another. Well, they really are complete opposites of one another. An archetype lies behind a thing. It's kind of like it's larger than any one manifestation of whatever that thing is. A mother is an archetype, but there are so many different ways to be a mother. Whereas there are stereotyped mothers, of course, for better and for worse. So I'm interested in the archetypal nature of gender, I guess, rather than the stereotypical nature of gender.
Yeah.
And I think actually speaking to what we were talking about before, another thing the books have in common is this, I have a real fascination with how little we can know about other people. As much as how much we can know about people, I think how little we can know about other people is also really interesting. And both of these novels, in a way, revolve around a sexual experience. Actually, they're both sexual experiences that, in a way, most of the characters are kind of locked out from. That we never really know what other people are like when we're not present. I think that's so interesting, except for through reading fiction. That's almost the only way that we can get at private experiences, because in any other scenario, we're going to be there kind of spoiling the privacy,
Just a fly on the wall.
Yeah, right, and kind of changing the dynamic. So I think that's a kind of a preoccupation of both books, a kind of the sense of being shut out from other people's experiences and what that kind of makes you feel.
And has that preoccupation followed you into the next work, do you think? Or?
I don't think so, actually. I don't think so. That's an interesting question. It's I'm working on my third book at the moment. It's still very short, so it's maybe too early to tell. But it's funny. My experience so far with both my novels is that I find that you only really understand something long after it has been published, and it's really strange. There's all sorts of structural integrities, kind of thematic things that come out. A book really changes over time, which is weird because it doesn't change at all. But there's this way that it kind of, it's like it's a reflection of you, I guess. It reflects much more about you than you ever realize at the time. This can be quite horrifying. Yeah. I always say it's almost like, I never read my work after it's out in the world, but I always say it's almost like coming across a bunch of love letters that you've written to somebody who you no longer love and definitely no longer loves you. Yes, it can be very exposing.
Yeah. I think perhaps maybe we have a few minutes for some audience questions, and we have a microphone circulating. Yes, down the front.
Yes, thank you for all that, and I'm a big fan of the Luminaries, and those architectural, cathedral-like qualities you're talking about. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about it as a New Zealand book. Clearly it's set in New Zealand and very deeply rooted, and it has a wonderful sense of New Zealand not only as a place, but as a connected place with Australia and China and so on, and a place in time in a sense of national development and so those transitional things about it. But I was wondering if you could talk about your ideas of how your book fits in with the canons of New Zealand literature, because it's a rather un-New Zealand book in some ways for its scale.
Very much, yeah.
I think of the typical New Zealand fiction being a short story, and I was wondering if you were deliberately, consciously trying to seize that tradition and wrench it in a different direction. Oh,
that's a great question, yeah. New Zealand literature really didn't have a 19th century, and in many ways it began with Catherine Mansfield in the 20th century, and so there was a kind of beginning with modernism as a very strange place to start for national literature. There's kind of no romantic traditions. There's kind of no imperial traditions for the modernism to kick against or to revise in any way. It's baffling to think that the first ever Māori person to write a novel is still living. Is still publishing novels, and it's crazy really. The literary history is so incredibly short. But my big confession is that I actually don't really know that much about New Zealand fiction for adults. I know a lot about New Zealand fiction for children, which is very, very strong, and in a lot of ways has influenced the Luminaries a lot more than fiction for adults. It's probably not really something that I thought about that much. I don't think I was thinking formally of the New Zealand novel as an aesthetic that I was either kicking towards or kicking against. It's certainly an outlier in terms of, I can't think of other New Zealand novels that it would sit kind of alongside, really. But I think that maybe it's just the virtue of there being such a short history in the country anyway, that there would be a lot of novels that you could say that of in New Zealand. I think it's both a blessing and a curse, I found, to be from a country from a country that has a kind of a general a kind of a general place in everybody's imaginations. And this kind of, New Zealand is a very beautiful country. It's very peaceful. It's remote. It's kind of naturally stunning. And the people are kind of friendly and benign. I think that's kind of the general kind of consensus about New Zealand. But it poses this problem as a novelist because you find that the people around you when you're at home are going to be very different readers of your work than people overseas. If you mention a street name, if you mention even a city, any one of even the major cities, you can't necessarily guarantee that somebody overseas is going to have heard of those places, where they have heard of the country as a whole. And so I think, in a way, I was contending with that in the book by, the Luminaries kind of uses New Zealand as a kind of a backdrop in this kind of national sense. It's a place of adventure. It's kind of the place of dynamic landscapes and grandeur and beauty and that kind of thing. But it doesn't really contend with the culture of the place at all. None of the events in this novel took place, really. They're all it's all invented. And the plot is all my own invention. But it is actually, it's a really interesting problem for contemporary New Zealand novelists, where for many, many years in the 1990s and early 2000s, you saw this kind of wave of kind of almost non-New Zealand, these New Zealand novels that were set in New Zealand, but it was like all the defining New Zealandness had been stripped out of them. That the writers seemed, to me at least, a little bit fearful of the specificity of the place, that as though to be too specific would be to admit that the place was kind of lame and that nobody really knew about it. And so there was this kind of effort to make it any old place that could be in anywhere in the Anglosphere. And I think that there's a real revolt against that now. There's much more of an embrace of Māori culture from white writers, Pākehā writers in New Zealand, and much more of a kind of a consideration of what makes New Zealand itself, but on the pages of contemporary writing, which I think that's more recent. But yeah, cultural cringe. I don't know if you have that expression here, but it's something you hear very often in New Zealand. This idea of kind of embarrassment about the kind of the lameness of or the kind of inconsequentiality of your country. Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for writing this amazing novel. I'm reading it now, and I know nothing about astrology, and astronomy. So thank you for the view into what's going on with Anna and Lydia. I'm a post-colonialist by training, and I can't help but read that Victorian style with a post-colonial view, and the peeks into the various characters' lives, and then how you sort of double back into their sort of interiority, and then you double back and make fools of them. So when Balfour meets Tohare, I feel like I'm butchering his name, as Balfour does. There's an irony. And you sort of unpick these characters. And I think how that speaks really interestingly to what you were saying earlier about there not being a a history of New Zealand literature, but how your novel sort of speaks to the imperial history of a British Victorian lit, and if you were kind of working with that, thinking about the set time of the temporal location of the novel in relation to the style, which is so funny.
Oh, cool, great, thank you. That's a great question. Certainly, when I was reading, kind of doing my research for the book, kind of immersing myself in 19th century fiction, one of the things that I noticed was how often scraps of French, Italian, Russian, occasionally German, work their way into 19th century novels and are left untranslated because the assumption, or unfootnoted, because the assumption is that the reader has a very particular kind of classical education that would mean that they would know those languages. And I decided in my book I wanted to do the opposite. So I wanted to take Māori and Cantonese, and those would be the languages that I would leave untranslated. They're both traditionally spoken languages, which would hopefully leave almost all of my readers out to sea. And I actually don't speak either of these languages, so I had to have help in kind of putting them into the book. So that was one way in which I was kind of trying to subvert the novel, the form. Another way has actually to do with the kind of what happens in the plot. I was thinking, I had this very terrible run of reading where I read about 5 books in a row where the heroine meets a tragic end in a row, and I was just feeling very depressed about the kind of the fate of women, you know. And so I had this idea that I would actually begin the novel in a place where traditionally a lot of 19th century novels end it. So in the Luminaries, the plot kind of begins when this young woman, Anna Wetherill, who in the kind of astrological schema plays mostly the moon and sometimes the sun, depending on what's happening. But she's discovered unconscious in a roadside, presumably high, having taken too much opium. She's recovering from an overdose. And when she wakes up in jail, she discovers to her astonishment that the gown that she's wearing has been stitched full of a fortune in pure gold, and she has no idea how it got there or when anybody put it in, whoever put it in. And so this idea that we would begin kind of with this kind of thing that she couldn't explain, and that everybody around her would be so convinced that this was an attempted suicide, but that it was almost like a failure of imagination to not see any other fate for her than attempted suicide. I mean, there are just so many suicides in 19th century novels, and it seems almost crazy. It seems like there was this a kind of a cultural fear of a woman who'd kind of come into her own, and the only way to deal with such a powerful character would be to kind of just destroy her, because otherwise the novel would burst apart at the end, you know. So definitely her kind of journey, I suppose, her arc through the story. I was very much thinking about that. I was also thinking about how prostitutes as an archetype are so often stereotyped or worse than stereotyped in novels, where they're used as the occasion for the enlightenment of somebody else. So they just become the kind of receptacle, I suppose, for somebody else realizing about what a terrible life they have. And that always has really bothered me. And so I wanted to do something quite different with her, to not track this, by now to us, very conventional descent, but instead kind of give her some privacy and kind of give her some unpredictability and unknowability, so to kind of not take the ordinary route there. But I mean, in terms of the kind of thinking more broadly about colonialism, I do think that there's something wonderfully leveling about astrology, because it doesn't discriminate. I mean, what's so endlessly fascinating about the stars is that at any moment, what is happening above us right now in the sky, if we were to map that, it has never existed before. It is a pattern that has never existed before, and it never will again, because it combines this place on Earth with all the placement of all of the planets and the time of day and the time of year. I mean, it's so incredible that there are these snapshots that are happening at every point on Earth that are unrepeatable. They're just these unique moments. And I think that there's something wonderfully actually post-colonial about that, because it's kind of saying it does matter where you are. There isn't a seat of power. There isn't a kind of a given perspective. There are multiple perspectives, and they each have to kind of fight their corner in a really interesting way. But that being said, I mean, I do love this period also. So I have, while kind of wanting to, I suppose I bring my own politics to it, but I also I have a lot of reverence for these kind of grand imperial novels where the women die at the end.
Perhaps time for one more.
Any brave soul?
Thank you very much for talking to us this evening. It's been very illuminating. But I'm interested in how you plan such a vast novel. You mentioned 2 books earlier, Murder on the Orient Express and The Brothers Karamazov. Well, I'm sure Agatha Christie very carefully plotted and planned out Murder on the Orient Express. Presumably Dostoevsky did the same with Brothers Karamazov, but it's so vast, the sort of scale of yours, really. And so my question is, did you totally plan the novel so you knew how it was going to end and how it was going to develop, or did it? You obviously had a sort of very key idea as you started writing it. Did some of the writing and planning take place as you wrote it, or did you really know where you were going completely? For instance, in a Dickens novel, it must be very carefully plotted so he knows how it's all going to work out. I'd just like to know a little bit about your planning and plotting process, really.
That's a great question. I think it has to be a little bit of both. I think that what my personal feeling is that it's very important to know why you're writing and what questions you want to ask of the work and of the story. But I think it's deadly if you know what answers you want to find. So in preserving that kind of sense of your own curiosity can be quite difficult, because the deadliness can kind of creep in. I always knew where I wanted the novel to end. The kind of one of the conceits of the book is that these 2 young lovers who kind of form the luminaries at the centre of the novel are what is known as astral twins. There's this kind of phenomenon in astrology. If 2 people are born at the exact same instant, then this unique chart that's generated from the moment of their birth is identical for each of them. And most natural twins are born minutes apart, and so it's actually a slightly different chart. Caesarean natural twins would probably be astral twins as well, but they're quite rare. Anyway, so this idea of these 2 people kind of forming a destiny, sharing a destiny, and having these kind of journeys that in a lot of ways were the mirror image of one another, but that led them to this point of congress really together. And so I knew that I was going to end with them together, and that was going to be just before the beginning of the book. So the book was going to circle round, begin just after that, and then circle round until it ended just before it. So I had a sense of the shape. And I also knew that I wanted to write a kind of a murder mystery that everybody was treating like a murder mystery because of a lack of imagination, because they couldn't see that actually it wasn't a murder mystery, it was a love story. So I knew that too. But pretty much everything else I didn't know along the way. I read this fantastic book that was a big influence on me that's called How to Cheat at Everything. And it's written by a magician, and he, well, I guess probably a former magician. I think his magician friends will not be very pleased with him for having written this book. But he goes through and explains a whole lot of different confidence tricks that have worked throughout the ages. And I studied a whole lot of these, and I had these documents on my computer that had lists of things that I thought would be cool plot twists. And a lot of them I didn't use. So, for example, one of them that I did not use was that there are two people who are both pretending to be priests, and they meet, but each one thinks that the other one's a real priest because they know that they're only pretending to be a priest. So I thought that'd be really cool. So it was things like that, and a lot of them did make it in. The identity theft that forms the kind of the core of the story was one of those that I you just kind of go hunting for them. But I think that the element of surprise is really important, because if you're not surprising yourself, then chances are the reader probably won't be surprised either, because they will be smarter than you. Like they'll see ahead. Which is maybe one of the difficult things about Murder on the Orient Express. It's actually probably a more predictable novel than The Brothers Karamazov, I would say.
Okay. Well, I think that's probably all we have time for tonight. But thank you so much, Eleanor, for coming and chatting to us. It's been really wonderful.
It's really fun.
So could everybody join me in a round of applause?